my topic is about the server. On Tech Talk, my topic is about the servos kernel, a special purpose operating system kernel for the server machines. Let us know what is the servers kernel and server machines in the further slides briefly. What is kernel in operating system and what are the various types of kernel? A kernel is a computer program that is the heart and the core of an operating system. Since the operating system has a control over the systems, so the kernel also have control over the everything in the system. It is the most important part of an operating system. Whenever a system starts, the kernel is the first program that is loaded after the bootloader, because the kernel has to handle the rest of the thing of the system. For the operating system, the kernel remains as the memory unit until the operating system is shut down. The kernel is responsible for the low-level tasks such as disk management, memory management, task management, etc. It provides an interface between the user and the hardcore components of the system. When a process makes a request to the kernel, then it is called a system call. A kernel is provided with a protected kernel space which is separated area of memory, and this area is not accessible by other application program. So the code of the kernel is loaded into this protected kernel space. Apart from this, the memory used by the other applications is called the user space. As these are two different spaces in the memory, so communication between them is a bit slower. Functions of a kernel. Following are the functions of a kernel. Access computer resource. A kernel can access various computer resources like CPU, input-output device, and other resources. It acts as a bridge between the user and the resource of the system. Resource management. It is the duty of the kernel to share the resource between the various processes in such a way that there is a uniform access to the resource by every process. And coming to the memory management, uh, every process needs some memory space, so memory must be allocated and deallocated for its execution. All this memory management is done by a kernel. Device management. The peripheral devices connected in the system are used by the processes. So the allocation of these devices is managed by the kernel. So these are the four functions of the kernel. They are access computer resource, resource management, memory management, and device management. Kernel mode and user mode. There are certain instructions that need to be executed by kernel only. So the CPU executes these instructions in the kernel mode only. For example, memory management should be done in kernel mode only. While in the user mode, the CPU executes the processes that are given by the user in the user space. This is about the kernel mode and the user mode. So here basically the kernel mode should be executed the kernel mode should execute some instructions only by the kernel. So the CPU executes these instructions in the kernel mode only, and the user mode, the CPU executes the processes that are given by the user in the user space. So types of kernel. There are different types of kernel. There are five types of kernel. They are monolithic kernel. Monolithic kernels are those kernels where the user service and the kernel service are implemented in the same memory space. That is, different memory for user services and kernel services are not used in this case. By doing so, the size of the kernel is increased, and this in turn increases the size of the operating system. As there is no separate user and the kernel space, so the execution of the process will be faster in monolithic kernels. This is about the monolithic kernel. Let us discuss about the another kernel. So software kernel hardware. Advantages of the monolithic kernel are it provides CPU scheduling, memory scheduling, and file management through system cells only. Execution of process is fast because there is no separate memory space for user and kernel. Disadvantages. Coming to disadvantages, if any service fails, then it leads to system failure. If new service are to be added, then the entire operating system needs to be modified. So these are the advantages and the disadvantages of the monolithic kernel. Let us discuss another types of the kernels in the further slides. So coming to the microkernel, a microkernel is a different form is different from monolithic kernel because in a microkernel the user services and the kernel services are implemented into different spaces. That is, we use user space and the kernel space in the case of microkernels, as we are using user space and kernel space separately. So it reduces the space size of the kernel, and this in turn reduces the size of the operating system. So this is about the microkernel. It is completely different from the monolithic kernel. So microkernel has the user services and the kernel services, and it should be implemented in different spaces. So we use user space and the kernel space in case of microkernels. As we are using different spaces for user service and kernel service, so the communication between the application and service is done with the help of message passing, and this in turn reduces the speed of the execution. Coming to the advantages of a microkernel, if new services are to be added, then it can be easily added. And coming to the disadvantages, since we are using microspace and kernel space separately, so the communication between between the two are reduced. Coming to the hybrid kernel, a hybrid kernel is a combination of both a monolithic kernel and a microkernel. It makes the use of the speed of monolithic kernel and the modularity of the microkernel. Hybrid kernels are the microkernels that have some non-essential code in kernel space, in order for the code to run more quickly than it would be in the user space. So some services such as network stack or file system are run in kernel space to reduce the performance overhead, but still it runs kernel code as servers in the user space. Coming to the another type, nano kernel. In nano kernel, as the name suggests, that the whole code of the kernel is very small. That is, the code executing in the privileged mode of the hardware is very small. The term nano kernel is used to describe a kernel that supports a nanosecond clock resolution. This is about the nano kernel, and in before slide we have discussed about the hybrid kernel, which is the combination of a microkernel and a monolithic kernel. So let us see another type of the kernel, the last type of the kernel. The last type of the kernel is it is the fifth type of kernel, exokernel. In exokernel is an operating system kernel that is developed by the mid-parallel and the distributed operating systems group. Here in this type of kernel, the resource protection is separated from the management, and this in turn results in allowing us to perform application specific customization. In the exokernel, the idea is not to implement all the abstractions, but the idea is to impose as few abstractions as possible. And by doing so, the abstractions all should be used only when needed. So no force abstractions will be there in exokernel, and this is the feature that makes it different from the monolithic kernel and microkernel. But the drawback of this is the complex design, and the design of the exokernel is very complex. So this is about the different types of kernels. and what is the kernel. Uh, Thank you.